Dear friends, good evening. Thank you for joining us once again to another Gnostic Lab of Practical Application. Tonight, our topic is titled Psychoanalysis. But we want you to not think that when we speak about psychoanalysis that we refer to that thing that happens at a controlled environment under the supervision of some kind of mental health professional. We want you to embrace what is the revolution of the dialectic. This new doctrine that Gnosis gives us, in which rather than looking at psychoanalysis as something that belongs to a mental health professional, but look at it from the perspective of the analysis or the way to analyze the soul. Because after all, psyche refers to our soul. And in this particular case, knowing that we have a soul that is of a lunar nature, psychoanalysis is the one tool that gives us the opportunity to comprehend what is happening relevant to the dynamics of the ego. This is the process, the tool of choice for us to be able to comprehend and delimitate our values. But we're speaking here of our egos, of the good ones and the bad ones, the positive and the negative. Now, some people say, wait a minute, why do I want to get rid of my good egos? Why is it that we need to get rid of that which is positive? Well, allow us to say that the problem with our positive psychological aggregates, whether it is the aggregates of compassion or the aggregates of altruism or the aggregates of being serviceable or even the aggregates of gnosis, is that they do good, but they don't know when to do good. And remember, we pay karma for the wrong that we do, but we also pay karma for the good that we don't do when that goodness needs to be done. And the good example of these many positive psychological aggregates that we have within are those that tend to be altruistic. Are those that spring into action when we see someone out on the street standing on the side of the road with a big piece of cardboard and something written in black Sharpie. And as you look at the background, you can see that there are children playing, that there seems to be a baby carriage. And in that paint card, in that placard, they may have something that says, I need money for rent, or I need money for groceries, or I need money for gas. And what we have seen is that on those few that exist in the area where we live, well, they tend to go from corner to corner. And as they do that, they tend to engage many people. The fact that they have children with them playing, that there is a couple there that appears to be a married couple and a baby that is being carried around. But we have seen that as they move from corner to corner, the sign that they have tends to read something different depending on where they are. And some people may give them cash and others may give them gift cards for groceries or gas. But we have also seen them walk back into the parking lot and get back into an Audi or a BMW, maybe a newer edition of a Japanese car. So our good psychological aggregates, well, they serve a good purpose. Certainly they, because we have a magnetic center that is active, they help us come to these practices. They help us absorb the material. They certainly help us put it into practice. But when the goodness that is done by them is done at the wrong time, we end up encouraging poor behaviors in others. So that begs the question, okay, so if that's the case, how do I know when to do good? When is it that I should contribute? At which point is it that I know that I have to help a family? And that is indeed a very good question. We have to start by allowing the consciousness to perceive. We have done many practices before. You have all participated on these exercises where we project our heartbeat. And you know very well that without any specific effort, you can tell exactly what a heartbeat is. This also happens in our exercises of relaxation. We say bring the attention of the consciousness to your feet, to your toes, your heels, your ankles, your shins, your calves, your knees. And you immediately start feeling the relaxation associated with that focus of the consciousness. The same thing happens when we say bring your attention to that space behind your head, space in between your ears. And the moment you do that, you immediately notice the consciousness focused and the physical body response it perceives. So what we have to do is empower the consciousness to perceive that. And be very aware of what the consciousness tells you. And it is important that we do this because it is through the consciousness that we can experience the superior principles, the attributes, the faculties of our innermost. The ego is always confused. The ego is always translating incorrectly the inputs that come to it. And we need to empower the consciousness. So the whole purpose of this psychoanalysis is for us to start detecting what is what. And once we do that, understand the oppositions of the ego. And these oppositions, they happen all the time. I mean, how many times have you not said, I need to wake up early tomorrow to meditate? And then the alarm goes off and you snooze, and it goes off and you snooze, and before you realize, it is too late. You have to go back and you have to move on with your day, and you have missed the opportunity to do your practice. How many times have you not said, I need to start this diet or this health program, and something comes along and creates interruption? That interruption, that opposition, is what is known as the force of countertransference. And in terms of gnosis, every time that we are focusing our efforts into eliminating the ego will oppose, and it will create as much resistance as it can in some of the most clever ways possible. But listen to this. We want this to be very clear. The ego does not care if you want to meditate. The ego does not care if you want to sing mantras. The ego does not care that you are even reading and learning about the practice of the super dynamic of love, that you know about the Divine Mother Kundalini and her power, etc. The ego does not care. What the ego cares is that you do not have those tools available. It cares that you do not have enough attention to make use of that didactic so that it can self-preserve. This is what the ego wants. It just wants to stay around, and it will let you do many other things. This is why there's so many positive and negative egos. But the moment that you decide to grab those tools and use them, the ego will rebel. And the mechanism of rebellion is called identification, fascination, and sleep of consciousness. And allow us to tell you that when it comes to creating identification, the ego will do this in ways that the more you observe, the more surprised you will become. Because the ego is exceedingly clever. It is not that it's going to create a tension with something that is dramatic, though it will do sometimes, but it will use the most subtle of distractions. It could be a beep from your phone. It could be a smell. It could be a taste. It could be a memory. It could be an image of a shape. It could even be colors. And the moment you see that, and you allow yourself to be slightly distracted, you identify with that. And the mechanical associations of the ego will replace one image for another, one thought for the next one mental image frame for another one. And before long, you are already fascinated. And once we are into the space of fascination, well, the slippery slope into the sleep of the consciousness is very easy. Suddenly, 15, 20 minutes have gone by. You have been sitting comfortably in your chair or in the lotus posture. And now you realize, wait, how long have I been here? How long have I been here? I need to focus on getting this work done. And then you have to start all over again. This is the mechanism of the ego: identification, fascination, and sleep of consciousness. This is why the Buddhist tradition always tells us, just focus on observing, contemplate your thoughts, just as you would contemplate birds flying across the sky. Let them flow from one side to the other. And as you do that, empower the consciousness so that it can use its faculties of objective imagination, inspiration, and intuition. And then you will be able to see from where that thought is coming from. You will see if the thought is coming from your instinctive center, if it is coming from your sexual center, if it is an intellective thought, or if it is an emotional one. And as you see this, then you start understanding from where this comes from. You can understand what type of psychological aggregate is this. But notice that this is all associated to empowering the consciousness. And I continue to emphasize this because if you wanted to rely on your intellect to analyze this, you're going to see that it is so complicated that you're just going to give up and eventually you're just going to walk away. But what happens? The ego is super clever. Let's consider for a second that somebody accuses you or judges you in a way that suggests that you are irresponsible, that you are not trustworthy. Certainly, depending on who is uttering those words, that's going to have a greater or a lesser impact. But whatever the impact is relevant to intensity, there will usually be some aspects of our pride that will react against those words. And if our pride reacts, as you observe who has been in charge of the human machine and to whom the control is handed over, you could see that it goes from one psychological aggregate of pride that could be associated to vanity. And that immediately is handed over to a psychological aggregate of anger that could be frustration. So now, you were feeling your vanity hurt. And with the hurting of the vanity, we see a new aggregate now of anger coming into the human machine. For other people, it is not a psychological aggregate of anger what comes into substitute. For some people, it is another aspect of vanity, another aspect of pride. So now vanity is affected and another aspect of pride comes in, self-love. And now self-love is also hurt. And once self-love is hurt, there can be even a darker aspect of our pride. It could be aggregates of depression. So this becomes a chain of causes and effects. Some people see their pride hurt. That is followed by a psychological aggregate of anger. And the suffering that is induced for that anger is so intense that what happens is that the anger fades away and it comes to be substituted, replaced for aggregates of lust. And it may not even sound logical, but the intensity of the suffering is so much with anger that in many cases lust comes in, so that the person seeks to experience some kind of sensual relief, some sensation that is pleasurable to not feel the suffering that was there for the anger. These aggregates, they sit at the helm of the human machine and control it. But that only happens when the consciousness is not there, observing. So when it comes to this didactic of psychoanalysis. We want to understand, what are these transactions? What aggregate follows what other aggregate? We want to understand not only what is the exchange, but we want to understand how is that handoff of the human machine. Sometimes these aggregates are fighting with each other, they are in conflict with each other, and they conquer each other, and that is what happens. And you were very angry, and suddenly now you find yourself very emotionally charged, just precipitating yourself into a very, very low state of numbness. And you don't even know how you got there. Somebody would ask you, but what's going on? What is the problem? And you would be blank. Be like, I don't know. We need to be able to see, how is this constant motion manifested? Because remember, these are all flows of energy. Energy cannot be contained. Energy is in a constant state of motion. Nothing sits still. Based on the principle of vibration, that Hermetic principle, everything is always in constant movement. So we need to understand these transactions. Whenever we see that we're going to perform some practice and we see that there is something that opposes, suddenly it could be hunger, suddenly it could be tiredness, suddenly it can be remembering that we have something more important to do, suddenly it could be somebody calling us on the phone. We have to understand that these transactions happen because one ego comes to replace another one. Now you may say, wait a minute. What do you mean that somebody's going to call me? What does my ego have to do with somebody calling me? Well, do not underestimate the telepathic ability of all of our psychological aggregates. Because how many times have you not been thinking about someone to have them calling you, to have them knocking on your door, to suddenly come across them at the hallway in a supermarket? These are all telepathic events from one ego to the next one. So we have to understand what are these transactions. If you are ready to embark in some work and suddenly many obstacles start coming your way, you have to realize that these obstacles are not being pushed to you from someone on the outside. These are elements that exist within you that are calling these obstructions. And we have to assume responsibility for all of this stuff that is manifesting below the detection level of our intellect. We have to perform a transactional analysis. But as we do this, once we focus on this ego, or in the first one, or in the one that followed, how do we know which ego to focus on? Well, Samael says, you have to segregate the ego in question. And segregating the ego in question is fairly easy because we have already given a law that allows us to create. And that is the law of the Triamashikamno, the law of the Holy Three. So focus on three transactions. Focus on what you intended to do, what was moving you to do it. Focus on the next ego that came to assume ownership of the human machine, and then focus on the next one that came to replace the second. Now that we have those three, now we have plenty of material to work with. And when you do an exercise of retrospection, when you are educating yourself in the daily practice of meditation, you will see that suddenly an hour flows by exceedingly fast. But in that hour that flies so quick when you're meditating, you can dive deep into understanding what these three aggregates were. So let's say that if we stick to our original example, somebody hurt our pride. Let's focus on that pride. What do we do with it? If we're going to be segregating the ego in question, and we know that we have one of pride and one of anger, and then we have another one of pride coming back. Excuse me. What do we do with the first one? Well, as we empower the consciousness to observe, knowing that we're dealing with a psychological aggregate, that is this one of pride, we have to start finding out from where is this aggregate projecting. Now, I'm going to tell you this again. This is not an intellectual exercise. Don't be thinking about intellectually understanding the ego, because the mind has no ability to do anything with its own stuff. The mind cannot eliminate aspects of the mind. We always need of a superior power. So for those of you who are fairly new listening to this lecture, remember that as we do these exercises, we always seek to relax the body. We always ask the innermost to be the one guiding us in the effort. We ask the innermost to be the one officiating. We offer ourselves as an instrument so that the innermost can lead this effort through the consciousness. So now that we have asked the innermost to be the dominant entity at any moment during this exercise, then we embrace the principle of spontaneity. And as we focus on understanding from where this ego coming from, we then allow the consciousness to perceive this aspect of pride that was hurt. From where is it being projected? Is it pride that is being projected from our intellect? Is it pride that is being projected from our emotional center? Is this pride associated to our sexuality? Is this pride affected because it has been disturbed within our instinctive center? Or is this pride associated to our habits, the things that we do? Well, evidently, and of course, this always requires more analysis, but for the sake of this conversation, if somebody accuses you and judges you, something that hurts your pride based on the way that you're dressing, or the way that you're walking, the way that you're moving your body, the way that you sit, the way that you laugh. Well, these things, they have to do with the human machine. And the projection may come from the motor center. Remember, the motor center is located at the base of the head, top of the spine. If somebody says something that affects your pride, and it affects your pride in a way that the thing or the matter that you were dealing with was your means to bring sustenance, your job, etc. Well, those things are usually associated with the instinctive center. Instinctive because, well, we see there all the activities that have to do with survival impulses. If somebody is accusing you and hurts your pride on something that is associated to your intimate performance, with your ability to maintain a good intimate connection, your ability to satisfy intimately your spouse, well, then we know that that projection is coming from the sexual center. Somebody accuses you for being stupid, moronic, that you don't get it. See, how can you not get it? Why is it that I have to explain this to you so many times? Evidently, these are projections of pride that are coming from the intellectual center. So we have to understand, where is that? And it is important that we understand from where these aggregates are reacting. And that is because you will see that the ego, even though it is so astute, the ego is very predictable. And as aspects of pride associated to your intellect become affected, well, you can see that it is common for psychological aggregates of anger to immediately follow after that. But if your pride is associated to your emotional center, usually that is followed by other psychological aggregates of pride that are way darker. If it is associated to your motor, to your instinctive center, well, you can see that there may be aspects of you of ambition that may jump into play. So we need to understand what this structure is, because egos coming from specific centers create patterns, and they are then replaced by aggregates that are already known to you. And why is it that this is so important? Because we started talking about countertransference. Friends, this is important because if we have been working to understand our defects, and you know that someone is coming around and they say, I don't want to be disrespectful, but you know they're going to say something like that. And they affect or inflict pain in those aggregates associated to your intellect. Now you already know what's going to be following that. And if you already know, why would you allow yourself to fall in the trap? If you already know what is the drama, why are you going to make pretend that you're surprised? All that requires is for you to maintain yourself in that center of the circle of Tao. And you know that once that aggregate is taunted, this other one is going to follow. Now you are empowered to remain calm and allow the consciousness to perceive all of this dynamic of what is happening. So when that other ego shows up, you say, yep, just as we expected. And now that you can see that, you can observe that ego, and now you can focus on understanding into the next ego in question. From where is this other ego coming from? Sometimes an aggregate that is projecting from the intellectual center will come to be replaced from one that emerges from the emotional center. Sometimes aggregates that are in the emotional center taunted, they come to be replaced by aggregates that project from the intellectual center. Some of those aggregates are very clever, and they come back with ways to twist situations, to just play reflection and put the problem on the other person and create even more suffering. Many of those intellectual aggregates, as they come in, they start playing what about and creating tangents, and suddenly the conversation goes nowhere and just makes things even worse. But when the response comes from aggregates in the motor center, that is also a situation that has a lot of potential for damage. Because sometimes people grab stuff and they throw it across the room, or they reach out and grab, or they punch, or they kick, or they spit. It is imperative that you see why understanding the structure and the transactions is so important. Because now when you are looking at getting some Gnostic work done, when you see that it is impossible for you to meditate because there's always something that comes up, as you start applying this psychoanalysis, suddenly you start seeing aggregates that invite telepathically circumstances to manifest. And then the kids become uneasy and noisy and distracting, and now you cannot do the work. Or the dogs pee in the carpet and do other stuff, and now you cannot do the work because you have to go take care of that. Or maybe your spouse becomes sensitive to some of these telepathic impulses, and they respond as well. We need to understand the structure. We need to understand the transactions. This is how we deal with the psychoanalysis that is necessary on this didactic to eliminate our positive and our negative values. Friends, the moment that you start understanding how these egos behave, from where they come from, how they affect your thoughts, your sentiments, how they affect your actions, you have gained enough comprehension to see yourself using that objective imagination like the master says, united in vibrant harmony with your willpower. And allow yourself to see that defect sitting on the bench of the accused. If you were able to use your mind from the faculties of the consciousness and take the ideal plastic and change it, imagine yourself creating a hall of law where you see the judge and you see the bench of the accused. Because why not? Because with our mind, we have played with the ideal plastic enough when we're creating our fantasies. Anyone who has indulged in sexual fantasies knows how well we can play with the ideal plastic. So why not hand it over to the consciousness to make something that is useful? As that ego is sitting on the bench of the accused, understand, how is it that this ego complicates everything? Understand, how is it that this ego simply makes matters worse? But also understand that the moment that this actor is not there, the drama stops. The moment you eliminate this psychological aggregates, you break that connection to the next one in line. And now suddenly, and by now you maybe have seen this, somebody then attacks you and they attack your pride. But that aggregate is weakened. Maybe that aggregate is not there. And as a consequence, because that aggregate is not there to respond, anger is not there to show up. And maybe now you can say, I've noticed that after 10 years of doing this, I don't get angry that easy. I still get angry, but I can tolerate stuff a lot better than I used to. But this is only because we have deliberately invaded that chain of causes and effects, and we have broken it. We have removed an actor. When the actor is not there, the drama cannot take place. And just imagine what happens when we work with the first one and eliminate it, with the second one, eliminate it, and then the third one, eliminate it as well. The effect of this is not linear. The effect of this is geometric. Because if you have aggregates that invite the different reactions of different egos, and you eliminate those, now you have started to create gaps, to break the connections that exist. And now we have other aggregates that don't have the opportunity to show up. So we have to continue observing. The more we observe, the better we get. I would like to hear, now that we have a different environment today, if you have any questions. If we can make this a little bit more dynamic today, I think that it would be very useful and productive for all of us. So if you were to have questions, by all means, let's get into this transaction amongst us and let's learn from each other.
This isn't a question, but it is a comment.
Very well.
I've been on a pretty much a roller coaster ride with health issues with my parents, and being the one now that is a distance from them. So the roller coaster of trying to study these aspects of the ego and seeing how they play out and change to others is very much forefront. But I also have noticed that if I can stay rooted in that center, the energy does disperse. It's beautiful how that works. So I've got a long way to go, but for the most part now, I can see it happening. I can feel it happening, and it makes it easier to stay rooted and not give it any more energy.
Ricardo,
Yes, sir.
regarding this stopping or putting the accused on the bench in the hall of law, really like that. In a previous reading of one of Master Samael's books, he discussed the benefit of spying on or watching these egos go do their thing versus stopping them and taking these actions we're talking about tonight. Could you speak a little bit about the value of both sides of that, or at what stage we should do which?
When we speak about the fundamental elements of Gnosticism, one of those elements is associated to the psychological trainer. We have to develop the ability to steal the fire away from the ego. Some people think that stealing the fire away from the ego is equal to restraining the ego. And on the inside, they are reacting violently. You can see that the anger is consuming them. Their eyes are fuming, the smoke is coming out of their ears, but somehow they have educated their personality in such a way that on the outside, they will give you a smile and they will lower their tone and they will say certain things. That is not stealing the fire away from the ego. Certainly, we have to go through a transition. We have to learn to empower the consciousness. And that said, we cannot just allow our egos to go out rampant. Sometimes we just have to pull that emergency brake and just not allow ourselves to react. But there is a big difference between refraining from reacting and making pretend that you're calm, and refraining from reacting and remaining observant. Those are two different things. On the first one, we refrain from reacting, we make pretend that we are cool, and later on, somebody's breathing next to you and their breathing is a little loud, and that is enough for you to explode if you fall once again back into the trap of the ego. So we have to refrain, but we also have to remain observant. What does that mean? That does not mean make this an intellectual exercise. No, because the intellect, the ego controls the intellect as well. We have to empower the consciousness. So we are refraining, but all along, remember, we have done this every Thursday. You can ask your innermost, Divine Father, please, 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 bring that last state of relaxation. Please bring it. And as you breathe in and you exhale, you can feel it come in. And as you have done that, in an instant, you allow the consciousness to perceive what is happening at the level of the intellect when it comes to that aggregate that you have just refrained. You can see what you were scheming in your mind. You can clearly see the dense emotion that was brewing in your emotional center. You can clearly understand if you wanted to slap someone, if you wanted to stand up and walk away, if you wanted to clench your fists, if you wanted to just stop eating, if you can see how that was going to affect your motor center. And when we empower the consciousness to do that, that takes nothing but a fraction of a moment. So what Samael is saying, yes, we have to learn to refrain, but we have to refrain intelligently. This is not refraining as in don't react and stuff it. No, because we have been doing that for too long and it has not worked. We have to refrain and still be a spy. The spy is always hiding. It's always looking from behind the door. It's only looking out of the corner of the eye. And that spy is the consciousness. Let the consciousness perceive it. And once you have seen it, friend, as you comprehend this, as you invoke of that power of the Divine Mother, you can feel, many times you can just feel that power lifted off of your shoulders. You can feel the relief. But then, once the relief happens, that invites even more responsibility. Because now we have to make sure that we don't walk back into that old space. And how do we avoid from walking back into the old space? Well, because we have done structural analysis and transactional analysis. And now we know that there are some chains. We know that the ego does not get dissolved overnight, but we know that the Divine Mother can severely weaken the ego. And when we understand these chains of causes and effects, then we can anticipate very easily what is the next aggregate based on the patterns that the ego has demonstrated that it follows. John, I hope that that answers your question.
Magnificently done. Thank you.
So that said, I don't have anything else for you tonight. We have already gotten to the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for actively participating with us here tonight. Thank you for being so engaged and for giving me an opportunity just to be part of your family today. To everyone, have a good weekend. May all beings be happy.